Today I'll be working on replacing the front brake pads on this 2012 Toyota Corolla S model. The first thing that I'll need to do is remove the wheel, and in order to do that on this car I need my wheel lock key, which will go on this special lug nut. The first thing that I'll do before I jack the car up is to loosen the lug nuts while the weight is still on the car, so that the wheel doesn't roll. With the car jacked up and properly supported with a jack stand, I'll finish removing the wheel. I like to leave the jack in place just in case as well, as a kind of a secondary measure in case the jack stand fails. With the wheel off and out of the way, I'm just going to take a general look at everything here and see if there's any signs of obvious problems. And as far as I can tell, everything looks like it's in pretty good condition. I'm not going to change the rotors today. These look like they're in pretty decent shape. Some people like to change the rotors every time they do brake pads, but I usually leave them alone if they look like they're in pretty good shape and aren't worn too bad. So the next step in this process is going to be to remove the two bolts that hold the calipers sliders in place. And there's one here on top of the caliper bracket, and there's one down here as well. So now I'm just going to loosen the caliper pins here. Now I should be able to just slide the caliper out of the way. And I'm not going to let this hang and damage the brake hose there or anything. I'm going to make sure that's supported. So I'm just going to get that out of the way. And now you can see that the pads are still in the caliper bracket. And those will need to come out next. There's some clips holding those in. Here are the pads that I chose to use as replacements. These are Adaptive One pads from Napa. And I've never used these before, but they are sort of the higher end pad that Napa offers. They're supposed to be progressive friction ratings, I guess. The inner pad is different than the outer pad and all that sort of thing. I chose them because they told me that there would be less brake dust with these. So we'll see how that, if that holds true over time. But anyway, these are the pads, and it looks like it comes with some anti-squeak brake grease and some new hardware clips and all that sort of thing. I've got the brake pads out of the packaging, and you can see that they've got the integrated shims built in, which is nice, and they're also labeled inner and outer so that you don't mix them up. I think you could put these on either way. I think mechanically the pads are the same, but like I said before, the friction material on each of the pads is slightly different for whatever gimmick that is. And then inside the hardware bag are replacement clips. These are the clips that go onto the brake pads themselves, and then these are new clips for the caliper bracket here. Next I'm going to install these clips onto the new pads, and I'm going to match what was on the car originally. So here is an inner pad with the old inner pad, and you can see that on this one the clip is on the right side. So I'll also put this clip on this right side. And then on the outer pad, the clip is on the left side, so I will put this clip on the left side as well. And the clips just go on to the pads like this, with the tab part facing the friction material, and they just kind of clip on and seat in like that. There's a little tab on this side that fits into a groove in the pad so they don't fall out once they're clipped in. and there's the clip for the outer pad. Next up, I'm going to remove the clips that are on the caliper bracket. I'm just going to use this small flat-headed screwdriver to get underneath and kind of work it out, and they just kind of pop out that way. And of course there's two on the inside that I'm not going to be able to show with the camera here, but I'll pop those out now. There are 8 caliper brackets supplied with the kit, and you can see that 4 are one way and 4 are the other. And the reason for that is that there is a top and a bottom on each side of the caliper. So this one happens to be a top. It'll go in and clip. The spring mechanism is always inboard or facing the axle when these go in. Okay, so these clips go in kind of the opposite they came out. It seems like the best way to do it is to put the outboard side in first and then kind of press down on the inboard side and get it clipped in. And make sure it's seated, and then now I'll do the top one. And again, I'll kind of do the same thing. Make sure that's seated, and now we'll do the backside ones. The next thing I like to do when I'm changing disc brake pads is to grease caliper slide pins. I've had a number of cars where these pins seize up, and then that causes problems with the caliper and the brake pads in the future. So what I'm going to do is extend this out, not so much that the boot is completely stretched, but so that it is kind of out and the accordions are stretched out. And then I'm just going to pull it back off of the pin, and you can see there's kind of a machined groove in there, and I'm going to put some grease in there. Okay, this is the grease that I like to use. This is Napa Sil Glide. It's a good high temperature silicone based grease. You can see I've got the pin all the way out. There's some old grease on there, and I've put some new on there, just a coating on the pin to keep it nice and wet. Then I've also taken a little blob, maybe a little bigger than a pea, and I've kind of worked it into the inside of the boot there. Don't want a ton of it in there so that it's going to force it to squeeze out, but just enough in there to kind of keep it wet over time. So now the trick is to get the boot back over the groove. Here, let me pull this out again. You want to get the lip of the boot back over this groove, if the camera will focus, so that it seats in and keeps all the grease inside. If you don't do that, then actually doing this could be worse than not doing it, because then what will happen is the grease can come out and the water and road salt and dirt can get in, and that'll cause the caliper pins to stick a lot sooner than they would if they just ran out of grease. So the best thing to do is just kind of work this with your fingers, and I should be able to feel it kind of pop in at some point. It feels like it's seated. Once it's seated, you should be able to spin the pin in there without the boot popping off. And I can kind of, slide it in and out without the boot popping off there. So that should be okay. I'll use this rag to kind of wipe off the excess grease so that we don't have any dripping onto the rotor surface, which would cause more problems. There, and then I'll just repeat the process on the bottom boot. Okay, you can see here's the bottom pin that I pulled out. There's a tiny bit of grease at the end of the pin, but the main body of it is fairly dry, so it was probably a good idea to get a little grease on here before things seized up on me. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is press the caliper piston back into the bore. I've gone ahead and I've cleaned up all the rubber boot here to get all the dirt and grime away from it so that doesn't get pushed in as this thing folds back in. And then I'm using one of the old brake pads as a shim, and I've got my vice grip clamps here, one end on the brake pad and the other on a flat spot on the caliper body. Okay, so I need to tighten up the grips a bit, and I'll just kind of slowly squeeze this, and you should see the piston kind of go back into the bore. Some people like to pull the cover off of the brake reservoir to kind of make this a little bit easier, but I don't like to do that. I feel like that might introduce air into the system. So if you put a little pressure on this and just kind of go slow, it works its way back in. And just as I go along, I tighten the vice grips up a bit as I go. And then once that gets close to being flush, that should be good enough. You don't want to push it too far in, otherwise you'll have problems that way too. It was probably evident in the previous clip, I'm not sure, but the rubber boot was kind of bubbled out on one side, and I just kind of smoothed that out and fixed it by hand. I don't want the rubber boot on the piston surface. Otherwise that'll get pinched under the pad once everything is back in place, and then you'll have problems. Okay, supplied with the brake pads is this brake pad grease that they give you, and they tell you kind of where to put it in that little diagram that's on the package. This stuff, I guess, is similar to the Sill Glide. You don't need a whole lot. In fact, you don't want too much, otherwise it'll drip on the rotor. In fact, I got a little on there with my finger now, and you don't want to get too much of that on there. In fact, I'll clean that out before I put the pads on. Okay, now I should be able to slide the pads in, and those just go in to the clips, kind of like that, and seat up against the rotor like that. Now the inner pad may be a little trickier just because I can't see it. Okay, and then the inner pad is there, seated as well, and I've got those seated in and up against the rotors, and of course they're going to want to tend to kind of fall away from the rotor, but you want to keep them squeezed in as much as you can. Okay, now I'm going to put a little bit of the Sill Glide on the surfaces of the shims here. Probably not strictly necessary, but I'll do it. I could use the stuff that came with it, but I think it's easier just to use this stuff. So just put a thin layer of the Sill Glide on the back of the shims here. Okay, now I should be able to put the caliper back in place, and I want to make sure I don't twist up the brake line. And if pushed in the piston enough, these should just slide right over. And mine's a little tight. I probably could have pushed that back in a bit. Then line everything up so that the ears on the caliper line up to the slider pins. And once those are roughly aligned, I should be able to just thread the bolts back in. There's the top one. Now, I may need to pivot this bottom one a tiny bit. I think that caught. Okay, now that those are hand tight, I can tighten them the rest of the way with the wrench. And there's probably a proper torque spec on these. that I don't have handy. I just kind of do this by feel. There, and that should do it for the caliper reassembly. Next I'll put the rim and wheel back on.